Hey Shaneil, how are you doing today? How was Heritage Day for you?
Hey, Jonathan, it was great. It's, I think, one of my favorite public holidays in the year. Friday.
Because we're Brying, because we're Brying, isn't it?
Yeah.
Do you know the reason for that holiday? What's the premise for those of our listeners who are listening from who are not from South Africa? What is Heritage Day about, Shaneil?
Yeah, so for me, and I think I probably stand to be corrected. I haven't Googled it, but my thought was always that we celebrate the numerous diverse cultures and heritage, obviously, for our country. We've got 11 official languages and, a host of different subsects of cultures. And I think it's just a day
Yeah.
to intentionally celebrate all of that.
Yeah. I think its origins actually come from the Zulu kingdom. I think they had a customary day that they celebrated, and I think New Age South Africa decided that it's actually a perfect day to celebrate everyone's different cultures.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
I
so
didn't know that.
it's pretty cool.
Yeah,
My
it
the
is.
CEO of the company I work for now was on that tip, explaining the reason behind it. That's why I know.
Yeah, that's awesome, man.
But Shanil, I want to know from you, photography. What are your earliest memories of cameras and pictures? If you can take
Yeah,
us through
sure.
that.
I think, mine has always been at like, I think I must have been like 4 or 5 years old, birthday parties, family things, and your dad or your uncle whips out this huge box like thing with a huge lens. And they you just hear like a clicker sound throughout the birthday party, and then you wait 2 weeks and you get back images of the birthday. And I found it amazing at the time. I was like, oh, how does this camera work? Like, where's this pictures going? And then of course the films, whipping out the film from the side, playing with it,
Yeah.
getting into trouble because you're ruining the photo. All of those sort of things. What about you, Jonathan?
Yeah, and I remember my dad always complaining about how expensive those little films were, so we had to handle them with care. And I think my one of my the memories I remember the most is when I dropped a cup of water over. We had a box which we put all our pictures in. So it ruined like a quarter of our lives was destroyed in 5 seconds. Memories lost forever.
Sure, man. Imagine, and look at where we are now, hey, with cloud computing and cloud storage. We'd never have to worry about that again.
Yeah. And Shaneil, just on that, one of the biggest companies back then, I remember, was Kodak.
Yeah.
Kodak was one of the big companies. So it was almost like a Nokia when it came to cell phones, synonymous with photography. Maybe you can just tell us a little bit about the company, how it was started, because I think it's an interesting case study. Yeah, how was it started, and sort of like the timeline of events that led to where Kodak is now.
Yeah, I think in terms of the country, the company, was it Eastman, hey? Eastman Kodak.
George
Yes,
yeah,
George
yeah.
Eastman. And I think this was an iconic example, and we'll probably get into that, of a company that founded a brilliant place in the market, that went through something amazing, that even founded the digital version of it, that was able to at least identify the digital disruption, and maybe then we discuss why nowadays it's not such a big household name. But I think in terms of the history, you'd probably be better to discuss that. My history of the company, I think, is just, I know it was around like 1975. They dominated the space, but maybe give us some background about the CEO or the founder.
Yeah, so the story is very interesting to me because it was founded by an individual. He wasn't like a camera expert or a photography expert. It was just someone who was passionate about photography. And in his mind, he kept on experimenting on how best can he make photography easier for himself. As time went on, he realized that he could make photography easier for everyone and make an event like taking photographs something that is accessible to each and every person on the street. And that's why he founded the company, which I thought was fantastic. And I really particularly liked the business model, right? because he had an idea, he had a purpose, but he also had a cash generating machine. And it was sort of like a twofold business model, where firstly, he wanted everyone to have a camera. So he made that easy. Cameras were cheap. Shaneil could take a photo, like our parents used to take photos at our parties back then. But the second part of the business model was film, because of the technology of the time, they quickly realized that they weren't able to democratize the creation of photographs. The taking of photographs they could, but it was very expensive to have people developing their own pictures. So they just centralized that function into the company that he called Kodak, and started selling film and producing pictures. And that became sort of like the profitable arm of Kodak, and how it became one of the biggest companies in the world at the time. So I loved that business model. I loved that sort of like purpose, like democratization of something. And I think democratization is a theme that is in many business models today, from YouTube to Instagram to everything you can think of. But they filed for bankruptcy in 2012, Shaneil. And maybe if you can just take us through, what were some of the reasons for that bankruptcy? What caused it? I know Kodak also invented the first digital camera, but it later put them out of business. So maybe you can just dissect, how can an industry leader like this lose so much market share, lose and become bankrupt from such a strong market position? And maybe what can we learn from that?
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. I think you framed that nicely and gave some great context about Kodak and the company. And they were really, the biggest at the time. There were very few names that were in the same category or the same sentence as Kodak when it came to photography. And I think, partially that is because the CEO or the founder had a great idea, found a great market niche. But when we start dissecting the business in a little bit more detail, another reason why there were so few competitors is because Kodak had really developed and refined quite a complex manufacturing process when it came to capturing and preserving images. And one of the things that I sort of researched and was figuring out along the lines here is that color film was an extremely complex product for them to manufacture. And if I recall correctly, it's like you needed to coat this with something like 24 layers of sophisticated chemicals, right? There were photosynthesizers, dyes, couplers, and a whole host of other materials. And because of this complex process, which is obviously firstly capital intensive and is an art, like let's just call it what it is. It is an art to develop film and create this process. It prohibited a lot of people from entering the space. So you've had a handful of competitors or market leaders who could actually copy or mimic this process. And that's why, they enjoyed revenues, good revenues for a long period of time. And when we start to dissect why exactly they failed as a company and why they then, filed for bankruptcy, one of the big things is, I think, to do with that is the change in technology. Let's start there. So firstly, there was a huge change in technology, and as we know nowadays, it's quite common. But when technology becomes more accessible, that opens the gates for smaller competitors. And the digital camera, digital photography, and digital images, they were cheap. They weren't difficult to master. The process was not complex, and you just get a whole host of people who started entering this part of the business. Kodak now has this very difficult decision to make, where should we can see there is some growth here, but as a whole, the specific segment is not making huge profits. But our current segment, which is the imaging and the chemical part of the business, is bringing in huge revenue. So do we transition and shift over to this digital industry that's looks like it's potentially losing money? Do we stay where we are currently and continue to make this money, even though we do see that sales are declining? And I think, and as we said offline, this is where you start to feel some sympathy for the board and for everyone else. It's a really difficult decision to make, or to justify to your board of directors, your investors, to say, look, guys, we're making so much money from this revenue stream. We're going to completely cut ties with it, and we're going to start moving towards this digital, where we're not really sure what's going to happen there. We aren't experts in the space. There are other people who are doing it. It's a more saturated market. It's just a difficult sell, Jonathan. So I think I'll pause there and maybe gather your thoughts on that before I move into the next point there. What do you think about that?
Yeah, one of the best things about looking back is having the benefit of hindsight.
Yes.
And when you start looking at things in a bit more detail, you might start thinking, what were they thinking? They must have been like the biggest idiots in the world. How could they not see this coming? But I think to contextualize that decision that they made, when you start contextualizing, like you're saying now, the factors that lead to making business decisions. When we talk about Kodak, a listed company, which has a ton of investors, right, who are more concerned about things like share price. There was no way you could convince a board that, listen, the future is digital. It's losing so much money at the moment, and this super profitable machine that we have, we should scale back. People would think you're crazy. And I think that's sort of why startups and small businesses will always have a window when competing with giants and industries, because giants cannot move as agile as smaller business because of those factors, because of boards, because of external circumstances, because of the fact that their established practices are producing a lot of profits. It becomes very difficult to explain. We even see it in businesses, that we work like now, for things to really shake up. It's either profits needs to be tanking or something bad needs to be happening for you to have significant shifts. Because what we know, when things are going good, there's no way you can shift things radically. It's very difficult to convince people when things are going well and the money is coming in. Yeah, so I think that context is important, just understanding sort of like that decision and the limitations of large corporations. But you have also seen in present day large corporations that have sort of instilled that sort of like change as a mantra. If you look at companies like Google and Facebook, it's almost like embedded in their philosophy, and their investors expect it. They expect there to be constant change and constant reinvention. Whereas I was hearing the PepsiCo CEO recently. I think she retired now. She was like, it's very difficult for established businesses that are not a Facebook, that are not tech companies, to just radically shift, because they established practices that work, and convincing people otherwise. As you said, they were in film, in the business of making film, and they had built up expertise. They had built up so much research into that knowledge center. Just shifting it overnight or over a few years was bound to prove very difficult.
Yeah, sorry, Jonathan, you.
That was my thoughts.
Yeah, and I think just adding on what you're saying, aside from the getting your mind around it and the policies and the red tape that you experience in these big corporations, when we look at this from a balance sheet perspective, especially for, and I think PepsiCo would also be a great example, but Kodak is a capital intensive business, right? They've invested a lot into their manufacturing equipment, into the chemicals, into all of those stuff. And one of the beauties of, beautiful concepts, I guess, of large corporations is economies of scale. So they've invested this huge amount of capital, and they know that very few competitors can afford to invest the same. And as their sales increase, the cost per unit decreases. But now they're in an extremely difficult situation. It's scaling down. So when you scale down, you no longer get the benefit of an economy of scale. You've got these huge fixed costs. Your sales are decreasing. Either you need to change the price of your service or your product, or you're going to tank that revenue stream and have extremely narrow margins on whatever it is that you're doing. So I think we also underestimate in these high capital intensive environments where we investing a lot into the product or the fixed costs, how difficult it is to scale down. And this is obviously assuming that your asset is not depreciated fully and all of those things, without getting into too technical. But essentially, you need to manage that that aspect of your business. And I think that was really difficult for Kodak and for anyone to really do. I don't know what I would do in that situation. It's a very, very tough one to be in.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
what were some of the lessons, I guess, that you were thinking, that you'd like to extract from this, or some insights from yourself personally?
Yeah, I would like to rephrase that, Shaneil. Like, I would like, if we could, which is a difficult question, I think. What lessons can, African corporations, African startups extract from the Kodak experience? Are there any? And can we think of any right now? Is the bigger question. But I think for me, if I to start off, I think how Kodak started and how Eastwood had sort of like a purpose. He had his purpose and aim was to have everyone have that experience that he enjoyed so much, which is was capturing memories and having them for the rest of your life, and sort of like democratizing that for everyone. I think there's a lesson to be learned about, as a business or as a startup in Africa, really honing in on what are you aiming to do for the consumer, and what's the purpose of your business, and sort of like ensuring that does not change throughout your life cycle, so that whatever happens, you keep pivoting in and around. I think it would have been a lot easier for Kodak to make the decision to pivot into digital if they had remained steadfast in the reason why Eastwood established Kodak in the first place, which was ensuring that everyone could share, could have access to photography, and it could be accessible to everyone. Clinging on to film was not focusing on that vision and purpose that they had initially, I think. So that could be a lesson.
Yeah, and I think just adding to that, when you and this is why it's so important to have the different roles in the company. The CEO is the visionary, right? And he understands the business for the way or the need that it's satisfying for the customer. And I think as you go along and you start to scale and you hire your Harvard grads and all of your MBAs and your accountants and everyone very finance related, the balance sheet becomes extremely important over this time. And if you have to look at the balance sheet and understand this, and you say, what business are we in today? Kodak would say, we were like a chemical film company and an imaging company. And that makes perfect sense from a balance sheet perspective, because that's where your revenue streams are coming from. But I think at some point they forgot that they're actually a moment sharing company. And I think that was the vision of the CEO. So I think that's something really important when you're experiencing disruption in your market or growth in your market, to sort of take it back to the vision of your company, the vision of your business, what you're satisfying in terms of the customer need, and then approaching that with some humility. Because even if you have a big balance sheet, it's not always a positive thing, as we've discussed. So I think for me, those are some key insights that I would want to extract from this case study going forward.
Yeah, I can't think of any more, but what I would say is that if any of our listeners have any more that they would love to share, feel free to share on our multiple platforms, and we can also give feedback to everyone else.